Welcome to the MI Hunting Podcast. On this episode, I'm going to tell the story about the Lake Michigan Doe. All right, welcome to the MI Hunting Podcast. Thank you for listening as always. So, it is just after Christmas now, and the season, we've got only really about a month. We've only got about a week left of the season until deer season's over. There are a few areas that will still have a later season yet. At least here in Michigan, I'm sure, and then outside the country, of course, there's still plenty of deer season left in certain areas as well. But for us here in Michigan, it's pretty much a wrap. Right now we do still have a late firearm antlerless season that's for private land, and then of course we still got the last remaining bit of archery season as well. But overall, the season is over for the vast majority of us. I myself, this year, had found plenty of success harvesting lots of deer between here in Michigan and my South Dakota trip. Now, I didn't actually achieve a couple of my goals that I had set for the season, or for this year anyways. My main goal was to harvest a buck on public land with my bow. I've gotten some areas where I had some good bucks that I was trying to target. I just never was able to, put the pieces together and be, in the location the time that the deer were going through. There are plenty of times where I would, be in the right area. I just was, either at the stand a day late or I was there a day early. And then my cameras, would show me that, I'd either missed him by a day or I beat him by a day. And then on the private piece, ultimately the rut hunt didn't go as I planned. Ultimately I did miss out on the opportunity of the mature buck that I was targeting. Ultimately I had planned to do an all-day sit. I didn't end up sitting all day, and that's, of course, the time that I missed up the opportunity. The buck came through past one of my stands at noon, and I was already, back home dealing with some vehicle issues, and, by the time I made it back out, the deer had already moved on, or at least moved off the property, so I missed my opportunity there. Ultimately, during that rut hunt, of course, I missed a buck with my bow. Ultimately the buck came in and I wasn't able to properly range it. So I estimated what the range was. I estimated that the buck was at 35 yards. So I held my 30-yard pin high on him, and ultimately he was right at 30 and I shot right over his back. Ultimately I did end up getting a buck there in rifle season. Wasn't really the buck that I had would have initially targeted, but he was a good buck either way. So I was happy with that. And then, of course, I got my mule deer buck out in South Dakota. Again, not the caliber buck that I initially planned on going after, but with hard times and the lack of bucks in the hunting area that we were targeting, I ended up taking the best buck that I could. So, once I got back from my South Dakota trip, we did a few drives. The area that we typically do our annual drive at, is either that the deer just have it, too well figured out of avenues to evade the people sitting and waiting for the deer, or, ultimately I think the area just gets too overpressured between other hunters and people just walking. Even when we were doing the drive, one of our sitters actually was sitting there, and coming up from behind him was a couple with their dog as they were walking. So the area gets a lot of human pressure. Jump into, end of November, muzzleloader season opened up. My goal was to hopefully, harvest, one of my target bucks, deer muzzleloader as well. I really wanted to be able to do some tracking. So, waiting on a good snow, go out and cut a track and try to track down a buck that way. Ultimately, we didn't really get the snow that I had hoped for, but I wanted to go out anyways. So I went back out to our main spot where we do our drive. It's along the Michigan Lake shore. And ultimately went out there kind of do a twofold, do a kind of like a spot and stalk, still hunting approach, cut a few tracks if I could because there was some old snow there, and then ultimately to scout it out a little bit better to try to figure out maybe a better approach for when we do our drive. So went out there, and unfortunately with the way the snow was old snow that basically had fallen and then warmed up and thawed a little bit and then refroze again. It was extremely noisy snow. So, trying to catch up with any deer without them knowing that I was, coming was very difficult. I ended up, basically the first, main valley or draw that I was going to basically kind of look over or scout a little bit. As I approached the ledge of that bluff there, I could hear deer movement down in the valley below me, down in the cedars. I couldn't see a deer moving, but I could definitely hear him walking through. Ultimately, tried looping around that valley to try to kind of cut them off or to change my direction or approach to try to catch up with the deer. Ultimately, that didn't happen. They evaded me over the next valley as well. Making it to a big bowl where basically it's kind of a main area before the last push when we do our drive. And made it up in there, found a lot of good deer sign, a ton of rubs, definitely a hub of activity. As I continued to move forward in there, found a few bedding areas. Basically this is up on the hills above Lake Michigan, and pretty much anywhere where there was significant cover. So you had a lot of mature hardwoods, deadfalls, anywhere where there was a big group of cedars. That seemed to be a congregation of deer sign and bedding, as well as any major benches. So anywhere where it was open and a flat area for the deer to bed. It seemed like a lot of the does especially were bedding in these areas. So after that scouting trip, about 8.5 miles in for the day, basically scouted all the way up onto the hills, all the way down to the flat areas and the open fields, and really got a good lay of the land. Ended up coming across, like I said, lots of good bedding areas. A majority of them were doe bedding areas, but certainly is a good place to, find having that concentration of deer movement. Did end up finding an area where it was just one of those things where the terrain just worked just right for you, where there's a couple of hilltops, a saddle that ran through it, walked through that saddle, and just on the one far side of the field into the hardwoods, sure enough, there was a big old scrape there. Followed the tracks along following the terrain, and found a couple more scrapes as well as some major rubs. Basically, they got into a thick area where there's plenty of deadfalls. There's lots of beech saplings that were growing up in there. It kind of looked like the trail kind of split off into two different directions. I followed the one off to the right, no more than another 50 yards, up on a little tiny hilltop with a deadfall and lots of thick saplings around it. Sure enough, found what appeared to be a lone buck bed. It was a very large bed. There were some large droppings right in that same area. But unfortunately, due to the lack of snow and the significant cover in there, I don't know if I had bumped that buck out of his bed. I'm assuming I did because of how fresh the sign looked within that bed. It looked like there wasn't any type of additional snow or old snow that was in it. Ultimately, though, because of the cover and the lack of snow, I couldn't tell which direction that buck had gone or how long ago he had taken off. But ultimately learned a lot, found another good area, basically walking along the field edges, and every little patch of woods, found significant signs, so major rub lines, as well as probably one of the biggest scrapes I've ever found in my life. This thing was probably a good 5 feet in diameter, and just in this little patch of timber, surrounded by field. And then that was a wrap on the muzzleloader season. So ultimately didn't get the opportunity that I'd hoped for trying to track down a deer, but I did learn a ton of scouting. So fast forward a little bit, a couple days after muzzleloader season, I decided to go back into that same area with my bow. Ultimately, having scouted and seen the sign that I did, I wanted to set up in that bowl that had all the major sign and rubs in it that I found, basically the week before. So packed in my bag, loaded up with a ghillie suit, basically plan on doing a ground sit and just kind of, basically kind of sit in that bowl. Hopefully some deer would move through. And if not, I would basically do a still hunt, checking all those major spots, basically in those patches of cedars where I'd found deer sign before, and hope that I could catch up with one doing that. Going out there just before daybreak, take the main trail to get up in the hills. I walk along essentially the lake shore, on the lakeshore side of the hill. So hopefully to be able to get in the spot and not, announce my presence walking through the timber. And essentially I was on the west side of the hill, and we had a southeast wind for the day. So I thought with that, most of the prevailing winds were going to blow my scent out off the hill over the lake. So as I make it through there, in the dark, walk along the lake shore, I did have a pretty cool sighting of one of the freighters going through. Basically, you can see it all lit up. So finally make it about 45 minutes and just about to get to the bowl I wanted to hunt. As I made it to the edge, I started creeping through, trying to get up to the spot I wanted to get up to, close to where one of the major runs is, where I saw the majority of the deer sign, as well as a lot of the buck rubs. There's one more little hill I had to crest, and as I'm walking up there, I'm just about to head up this little hill, right up to my spot that was only about 10 yards on the other side. And as I walk up, I hear a single deer blow. Instantly, I hit the brakes, stand there as quiet as I could, and sure enough, another blow, and the deer, you can hear it take off. And at this point, I'm just kind of sitting there wondering kind of what happened. I didn't think that the deer could hear me. There was a bit of crunchy snow, but I was trying to walk on the sand and whatnot, basically trying to be as quiet as I could. And next thing I know, I feel a little bit of a breeze blowing on my neck, realizing that there was a bit of a wind swirl, and it blew my scent up towards where this deer was, up the hill, up into this bowl. So having realized that this deer just winded me, I sat there for probably about another 5-10 minutes, just letting the area soak and kind of think about what my next step would be. Basically just trying to sit there, kind of feel for the wind again. Was it a one-off, a little bit of a swirl there, or did the prevailing wind still going to carry my wind out over the lake? So at this point, I started getting the rest of my hunting gear on. I brought my ghillie suit along, having success with wearing a ghillie suit and sitting on the ground before. So I throw my ghillie suit on with the rest of my gear. Once I'm dressed, make it over to the other side of the knoll, get my spot set up in a little bit of brush. And as it started to get daylight, I could still feel the wind, feel like it was shifting quite a bit. So at this point, pull out some milkweed. Sure enough, send the milkweed out. It goes out in front of me about 10 yards, starts drifting down the hill, right in the direction I wanted to. 10-15 seconds later, I see the milkweed blowing back up the hill, back in front of me again. Throw some more milkweed out, same thing. Blows out, goes up the hill, goes down the hill. Basically, at this point, realizing that, despite having a prevailing wind blowing my scent down the hill, out away from where I thought the deer would be, because of the lakeshore, that wind was blowing back up into that bowl. And deciding ultimately that this was going to be a bad setup, that there wasn't going to be any deer that were going to enter in this bowl with the wind swirling around the way it was. Any deer that would enter that area would know I was there, probably almost immediately. So at this point, decide I'm going to pack up, move up the hill a little bit, and maybe once I get at some little bit more elevation, get out of the V-shaped part of the bowl that I'm in, that maybe I can be up on top of the hill and have my scent start blowing up, essentially up above the deer's head, and maybe it'll just blow my scent up and out of the bowl. So I make my way another 30-40 yards up the hill to another patch of brush, like shrubbery that I was going to sit in, kind of use as my cover or my ground blind. As I approach, I look on the other side of these little knee-high bushes, and there, right smack in the middle, is a deer bed. So clearly that was the deer that I had probably bumped out of his bed, and it spooked out of there. So I had the right idea. I had the right spot. It's just the execution, especially in knowing what the wind was going to do. That's where I essentially failed. So ultimately, I looked at that as, I had the right idea. I was in the right spot. It was just being able to, or have the experience being in that spot of knowing what the wind would do, even with a wind that was supposed to be blowing my scent away, having that wind swirl. Now, when I was there the week prior, I was in that same bowl and I did another milkweed check at that time, but it was later in the day. So I think what happened was that being later in the day, a lot of the thermals were pulling up, still being late morning and whatnot. The fact I was there before those thermals could work in my favor, it wasn't pulling any of my scent up out of the bowl. It was allowing it to swirl around in there. So it's another good spot for, something in the future. Just have to be much more mindful about the execution of the area in regards to the wind. So more than likely what's going to end up happening, instead of trying to come from the lake side, have to come from the wood side and basically get up above the bowl and allow that wind to come off the lake into my face. More than likely that's probably going to be the best course of action going forward. So, having been there for probably about 30-40 minutes and realizing that spot was going to be a bust just because of the way the wind was swirling and the fact that I'd already bumped the deer out of that area, ultimately the goal is now make my way back and do a little bit of still hunting, maybe even do a little bit of spot and stalk if I can find a deer that doesn't realize I'm there. So start making my way back down towards the trailhead. There's a couple different valleys on my way there that have patches of cedars in there. So my goal is to go up on these ridge tops, check for deer, and use the ridge tops to either duck behind or use as cover and loop back around. That way I'm not walking through open timber. First ridge top there, didn't see any deer in that first patch of cedars. So I scouted out along the ridge top a little bit, marking out some of the main trails that the deer use to crest over that ridge into that next valley. So I then go back down along the lakeshore over to make it to the next valley there. Same thing, as I'm walking up along the ridge top, I'm approaching another patch of cedars. Now this ridge, it's not quite as high. It's a little bit smaller bowl, at least for this middle ridge that I'm climbing up on. And basically it's kind of like a flat top where I'm not sure if it's just from other people walking along them or from deer or other animals. Basically it's basically worn down the dirt in the midst of some of these mature hardwoods and cedars. So as I start approaching this patch of cedars, I make it about 50-60 yards from it, and then all of a sudden I see tails. And sure enough, 3 does bump out of that patch of cedars. I try kind of run along with them to get up along the ridge line so I can see where they're going, if they're going to stop just on the other side of the knoll. But by the time I get up there, they're long gone over the crest of the other hill. So again, had the right idea, picked the right spot, just the execution to capitalize on those deer that are bedded in those cedars, just messed it up. Make my way down the rest of the way, checking some other spots where there's more of a grassy, brushy area. No deer in there. So I make it down to the main part of the trailhead once I get off the main bluffs. At this point, I start shedding a few layers, take my ghillie pants off, having gotten caught up in tons of brush and sticks and briars and everything like that. Decided to shed a bit of a layer down. I was going to make my way back, scouting through the hardwoods back to the vehicle. And as I'm shedding layers and taking some of my gear off, I look down along the beach, just kind of overlooking everything, and way off in the distance, standing, basically at the edge of the water, I see an animal. Thinking like, oh, there must be someone out walking, that's her dog. Looking a little bit closer, and it's like, that doesn't look like a dog. Pull up the binoculars, is a deer standing on the beach, basically, at the edge of the water, looking back towards the bluff, towards the hill, and into the cover. And at this point, I didn't know the exact distance because, my rangefinder, goes out to 450 yards, and I can't pick up the range. So it's well beyond the range of my rangefinder to be able to determine how far this deer is. At this point, it doesn't look like it's a big buck or anything like that. So it's either a doe or a smaller buck. But, one of those times, this is one of those things where, I've hunted in this area before along the lake shore, and I've encountered plenty of times where there's, deer tracks or have bumped deer, basically off the lower part near the beach before. And actually we had made plans to try to do kind of like going with like a boat along the lake shore to try to catch some of these deer that are going to be near the lake shore or near the beach or along the lake shore, come at them from an angle that they wouldn't expect. So this was kind of exciting to see, having a deer on the beach, especially this late in the day. Something I wasn't really expecting to see. So at this point, I basically at this point I decided I want to try and make a play on this deer, or at least try to get closer to see, what's going on with it. Maybe I can try to get a shot opportunity at it. At this point, it feels like a very, so much of a long shot, having this deer been so far away. Basically, now that I look back and I was able to pinpoint exactly where this deer was, looking at the distance, it was somewhere around, 630, 640 yards away from where I was at. So it was a good distance away. So I knew I had to cut some distance quite a bit. So I know there's a main trail that walks along the bluff here overlooking the beach. So pack all my gear up, start heading down, heading towards the deer, walking up on top of the hilltop. And, basically it comes in and out from right on the edge of the hill, and then it goes into the woods a little bit, cuts back out to the edge of the hill. So every time I had to follow the trail into the woods a little bit, just thinking the next time I pop out, that deer's going to be gone. There's no way it's going to be standing, on the beach still. So every time I have an opportunity, I take a peek down the beach. Sure enough, the deer is still standing there. Walk a little bit further, go into the woods, lose sight of it, pop back out along the edge, deer is still standing there. At this point, I'm about 250 yards out, and the deer is still standing there, standing at the edge of the water, looking back. So a little bit of me at this point is thinking, what is going on? Why is this deer out here in the open along the beach? I'm assuming that something either spooked it. It was another person that was out walking or something like that, or someone's dog, or, coyote had pushed it towards the lakeshore. I don't know what's going on, but something doesn't seem right as to why this deer is still here. So I continue to push forward, and then I get to a point where I kind of have to make a decision where I can go up another bluff or up another hilltop, which I know is very, very hard walking because I'd done it the week before, and I almost had fallen off the hill a couple times to trying to follow, the side hill, ledge that a lot of the deer trails are. Or I can go a little bit lower and side hill it a little bit lower on the flat part. So at this point, I decided to go a little bit lower because I know that if I go the other way, I'm going to have to go up higher in elevation. I don't really want to do that. So I decided to take this lower path. But the only issue with that is it leads me into an open area where there's just some low grass where I get out of the cover of the timber. So at this point, I take this trail and I'm wide open to where the deer can see me. And again, I'm now within 200 yards of the deer. So basically at this point, I've got my backpack on, I got my bow in hand. I just crunch over and start walking down the trail, kind of pretending like I'm a deer just walking down the trail. And I keep trying to peek over to see what the deer's doing, and it's just watch me cross this opening, probably about 200, maybe 150 yards above it. Finally get to the point where I'm directly above the deer, and I finally made it back into cover again. At this point, I'm trying to pinpoint or try to determine what path that I want to take. I can go down basically the edge that I just came across, hug the cedars, and try to get down to the beachfront that way. Or I can keep going past, get into the timber more, and try to go out around the left side of the cover and try to approach the deer that way. Or the other thing I was thinking is at this point, hug into this timber and wait for the deer to come up to me. So I make it into that cover thinking that, going the other way, I'm going to be too exposed. The deer's going to see me approach from far too away. As I'm getting into the cover there, I'm trying to get down to where I can see the deer again. So I walk down the hill a little bit, trying to stay as covered as possible, keeping as many trees or as much brush between me and the deer, and trying not to make too much noise to try not to spook it. I get to the little opening spot where I can see the deer, but the problem is the deer can also see me. And it's still standing there in the same spot essentially, where it's facing uphill at me. And I start noticing that the deer is holding its legs weird. I can't tell if it's the front leg that's holding weird or the back at this point. Pull the binoculars up, and as you know, the deer is basically looking at me while I'm looking at it. Sure enough, it looks like that front leg, there's something wrong with it. It's holding it up funny. So at this point, it almost looks like it must have like a broken leg or hurt itself somehow where the deer doesn't want to move. So I slide down the hill a little bit further, get a little bit closer. Yep, sure enough, it's holding its leg up. I can see that it's all swollen. It must be broken. So at this point, I'm sitting there for probably about 5-10 minutes, just looking at the deer. The deer's looking back at me, and I'm trying to decide what the best course of action is. Do I just wait it out here up on the hillside and wait for the deer to have to try to come back up to the hill to me? Or do I try to push forward and try to cut the distance to get the deer within range? Looking at the terrain and the amount of cover I have, ultimately knowing that if I decide to push it, that deer could essentially at any point spook or take off, or take off in a direction that I can't cut it off anymore. Ultimately I knew that I was in a good position up on the hill, knowing that the deer had to either pick left or right, and in either way it wanted to go, it could either walk down the beach or it'd have to come up the hill towards me. But the fact that this deer still hasn't moved from his original position, I'm starting to think that maybe this deer is injured enough where it doesn't want to go anywhere. So again, I get down to a point where I can either go left or right along the cover and try to use some of the hillside as cover so the deer doesn't know I'm approaching. Ultimately, I decide, because the deer is slightly quartering, basically it's facing me, but angled to my right a little bit. So I'm thinking, all right, if nothing else, if I can get close enough within range, if I go to the left, that allows a bit more of a broadside angle, a better shot potential if this deer doesn't go anywhere and I get a shot opportunity that way. I end up going to the left. Unfortunately, as I approach, I realized that there must have been some type of landslide or mudslide or something like that. There's a big washed out area where the sand had washed away, and it's about an 8-foot drop down into this little bowl where the sand is blown out of the hillside. And it's, at this point, I'm all geared up with my backpack, everything like that. I don't feel like trying to jump out into the sand, wash out. I'm just worried about injuring myself as well. So I walk down along the edge of it. Finally, I find a place where there was a tree that had leaned into that washout area, and it was only about a 4-foot drop from there. So climb out onto this tree, set my bow up on it, lower myself down, finally touch ground with my feet, grab my bow, and use the hillside as cover. At this point, though, too, the sand is so loose that I'm basically creating little avalanches of sand going down, getting close to this deer. And I'm just worrying that all this chaos with the sand moving and commotion is going to spook the deer and it's going to go the other way. Because again, at this point, I can't see the deer anymore, basically because of the hillside. Finally get to a point where I can get back towards the center, and sure enough, the deer is still standing there. At this point, I'm about 50 yards out, and the deer hasn't moved yet again. It's obviously seen me a few times. It can't win me because of the wind is coming off the lake. Again, same thing. I sit down and just kind of watch the deer, see how it's reacting, and trying to decide what my best course of action is. At this point, again, it's only about 50 yards straight line between me and the deer. It can go left, it can go right, and I still have potential to cut it off and give myself a shot opportunity. But again, I'm looking at the deer thinking, so at this point, again, I'm thinking that I'm going to continue to try to push forward, basically give myself, that much more opportunity to be able to get closer to the deer, give myself a better shot opportunity, regardless of what the deer does. But of course, at this point, I'm thinking every time I try to move up, that's more of a chance for that deer to spook, and I could blow it, and not have a shot at all. So again, looking at the deer, I could go left or I could go right. If I go to the right, it's going to it's a little bit easier pathway where I have a little more cover to get down to the deer, potentially keeping more of the brush and the trees in between me and the deer to get to that point. But again, if I go that way, then I have to wait for the deer to turn to give me a better broadside shot. If I go to the left, if the deer doesn't go anywhere, I still have a little bit better angle and a little bit closer to a broadside shot from that angle as well. I make my way down to the right or down to the left again and finally get past to where I only have one cedar tree between me and the deer. At this point, I get to a bit of an opening where I basically have nothing between me and the deer anymore, and it's at 40 yards. So I kneel down. I've already got my arrow knocked from when I was at the 50-yard mark, just thinking that at any point the deer's going to bolt. So I'm at 40 yards, and I'm kneeling down, and basically I've got cedar to my left, cedar to my right, and some branches overhead, and the deer's still standing there. At this point, again at 40 yards, I'm kind of hoping at this point that the deer might, take a step one way or the other, turn broadside, give me a good shot. And it's still standing there facing directly at me. So sitting there thinking about, what my next move is. Do I just wait for this deer to move? Do I, what do I do? I don't feel comfortable taking a front on shot at 40 yards, especially. So at this point, I'm sitting there on my knees. I take off my backpack to try to get myself a little bit lower profile. And at this point, I just decide, I've seen the deer move a couple of times where it tenses up as if it wants to move or take a step, but then it doesn't go anywhere. So I'm looking at it as though if, this deer wants to get off the beach, but she must be hurt enough to where she doesn't want to move. So at this point, I decide that I'm going to just crawl up on my knees a little bit and just continue to move up so I can get her to be anxious enough to where she's going to turn broadside or turn to get away from me. At that point, she'll provide a broadside shot and then a better opportunity to make a good shot on her and basically put down this deer that clearly has a broken leg. So I crawl out, go a couple yards, double check my range, adjust my pin on my sight. So now I'm at 38. Deer still doesn't move. She's doing a bit of a head bob, like she wants to. I'm not sure if she's still trying to figure out what I am, or is just anxious enough, knowing that she knows that she wants to get out of there. So again, at this point, double check, 38. All right, crawl up a little bit more, double check my range. All right, 35 yards. She's still standing there. She's definitely tense that she, doesn't want to stick around much longer. So I'm thinking that every second goes by, she's going to make a move left or right, and I'm going to have to real quick, get drawn on her. If I have to, try to get her to stop so she holds still if she's trying to take off. So I'm basically on edge during this entire process, thinking that at any second she's going to turn and I'm going to have to be quick, get on target, and execute a shot. So crawl up a little bit further, from 32 yards. Re-range again, reset my pin. It's like, all right, at any second she's going to turn. I need to have my pin dialed in exactly where I want it, as close as to my actual range. That way I can be as accurate as possible. She still hasn't moved. She's still facing directly at me. At this point, again, I'm just crawling on my knees, holding my bow in front of my face, and pulling my rangefinder every time I scoot up a little bit, every couple of yards. Finally get up to a point, and now is the last little clump of grass that's in between me and the deer. Ranger again, 30 yards. She's still standing there facing directly at me. So at this point, thinking, all right, well, this is probably about the closest I'm going to get. So dial in my pin at 30 yards and think, all right, at 30 yards, front on shot, definitely not ideal. But she's close enough now where I feel confident that I can at least get on target. It may not be a perfect shot, but if nothing else, it's going to get her to move and I can get a follow-up shot. Draw back on her, still standing there straight at me. Settle my pin and let the arrow fly. At this point, I've got, again, a lighted knock, and all I see is that lighted knock go right into, not quite center of her chest, but just to the left. And all of a sudden my knock disappears. She turns to my right, and I see the last probably foot of my arrow sticking out the backside of her with the broadhead sticking through. At this point, I know that the arrow has made it all the way through her and that it won't be long for her, basically knowing that, from the angle of the shot to where seeing the arrow sticking out the backside of her, that it was a lethal shot and she's gonna expire soon. She takes off running parallel with the beach, and she makes about 40 yards. Next thing I know, she dives into the lake, and she's in about knee-deep water. And then next thing I know, I see just a pool of blood fill up around her. It almost looked like a scene from like a Jaws movie where it's just her, splashing through the water and nothing but red around her. And within a couple of seconds of that, she falls over into the water, and I know that she's expired at this point. So at this point, I'm laughing hysterically to myself, just wondering what the heck just happened. How did this all work out? The typical, there's no way this is going to work, and it ultimately does, and you're just shocked because of it. So I'm walking down the beach to get up close to where she was, and as a bee, she's washing up onto the beach as I approach. I walk in about ankle deep water, grab her, pull her out of the water up onto the beach there, and sure enough, the shot couldn't have worked out any better. Right through the chest, exit out the backside ham on the far side. Deer expired in 10 or so seconds. As I pull her up, I realize that on her front left leg, her ankle is, basically completely busted. She's got an open wound, probably about 2.5 inches diameter. It's completely swelled up, and there's bones sticking out of the wound. So at this point, I realized that, this doe was hurting, and I made the right choice of putting her out, doing what I thought I needed to do to put the deer out of her misery. She was stuck out on the beach. I don't think she could make it back up the hill. Ultimately, I think what happened is that she was walking on probably one of those side hills, stumbled down the hill, and ended up breaking her leg. So at this point, got the deer out of the water, and the shock of the whole situation finally passed, and I'm realizing that I've got this deer down on the beach. Now I have to figure out what I'm going to do to take care of it. Fortunately, I had somewhat anticipated that if I got a deer, it'd be a tough chore to get it out. So I did grab some game bags and grabbed all my pack and everything like that had stuff to be able to process it, quarter it out. At this point, trying to figure out what I'm going to do down on the beach here. So I dragged the deer up off the beach a little bit up into the woods a little bit, to where I'm not quite right in sight of everyone and everything. Cutting up a deer and getting everything all messy on the beach. As I cut a piece off the deer, the wind's blowing, getting sand everywhere. So every time I cut a piece off, I walk down to the beach, go into the water, rinse the meat off, throw it in the bag. And I do that for both the front shoulders, the hind end, and the back straps. At this point too, I take the head with me, make sure I got my tag on it. That way while I'm packing everything out, that it's not, basically I'm not trying to be as legal as I can, ensuring that, they know that this is the deer I harvested and I've got my tag on and everything like that. So at this point, I'm at the base of this hill, and I honestly don't know how big of a climb it is. It's at least, several hundred feet up this, sandy bluff to get back up onto the trail to get back to the vehicle. Or I can walk several miles down the beach, down to the local beach there, and have my mom pick me up, having her only live about 10 minutes away. Ultimately, I decide, you know what, I got myself in this mess. I climbed down the hill knowing the potential of what was going to happen. I got to pack this deer up and get it back up the hill on my own. So go to grab my backpack and realize it is extremely heavy, much heavier than I had anticipated. I knew that individually the pieces of meat weren't all that heavy. I was not anticipating my pack to be as heavy as it was. At this point, knowing that it's going to be quite a chore to get up this hill. But again, I made a decision. I'm going to get myself out of this situation. So I start making my way up the hill, and it becomes a chore. The hill is steep enough and sandy enough where I have a hard time getting a good step. Basically, I take a step and my foot slides down in the sand, only a couple inches above where my foot was initially. So I work my way side hill away from the sand, try to get up where there's some grass and some trees to, basically give myself a firm footing to climb up the hill. I get over there finally, probably about 20, 30 minutes to get off the actual sand onto some sure ground to be able to climb. I make my way about halfway up, and at this point, I'm sucking wind. I'm stressed out because I'm worried about, this pack, pulling me backwards, throwing me back down the hill, and potentially hurt myself, or just, losing all the ground that I just, all the ground that I gained. So halfway up the hill, I have to sit down, catch my breath, and, kind of reevaluate my decision on trying to climb this hill. Ultimately, caught my breath again, start making my way back up the hill. And, I get to her, finally I'm sure ground, so I start making some good progress. And get to the last little bit where I had to figure out the best course of action to get over this ledge. Ultimately I found a log that had, was in the ground, but leading up to the last little bit. So I climb up on this log, use it as basically some sure footing, and to be able to hang on to pull myself up the hill. There's a little 2-foot little ledge I have to climb up on the edge, roll over on my back, lean up against my backpack, and I'd finally made up the hill. Well, at this point, having pushed myself to where I get up the hill, instantly I feel that feeling where you've overexerted yourself and I'm about to puke. Quickly try to undo my buckles on my backpack, and I roll on my backpack, and sure enough, I purge and throw up all the water I drank before down by the beach, trying to gear up for this climb. Ultimately, it was too much for my nervous system, and it had enough of that climb for sure. So finally getting all done with that, catch my breath again, gear back up. Now, at least it's easy sailing where it's basically flat ground down to the vehicle and more or less all downhill from here. At this point, I'm thinking, I don't know how, backcountry hunters do it. Big elk hunters do it, packing out their animals. At this point, I'm thinking initially when I started the whole process of packing out this deer that I quartered up and threw in my backpack, that it was going to be a fun experience. You know what? Anyone who packs out an animal that way, you can have it. It was a fun experience to say I did it, but it is not that enjoyable. So for you guys that go out there and, especially for an elk and take it miles out of the mountains, I want no part of that. at least not in the physical condition I am right now. That is something that, having done that short little distance that I did, climbing the one hill I did, that's something that I'm not eager to repeat in the near future. I made it back to the vehicle and, still just kind of tickled about the whole experience and just how many things had to go right to make it all fall into place. And out of curiosity, I grab our scale, stand on the scale with my backpack, throw my backpack off, climb back on the scale, and I'm shocked to realize that my backpack, with all my gear that I had packed on it and the deer meat, it came to 61 pounds that I carried out. And ultimately, I carried only about a little over 1.5 miles. Now, I did have to climb a massive hill that I wouldn't recommend to anyone else to do this, or I would never wish it upon anyone to try to have to climb this hill with that big of a pack on as well. But, ultimately, it was a fun experience that, well, it's fun now, but it was definitely one of the most unique hunts that I've ever been on. with one of the most unique outcomes, and so happy the fact that the shot ended up being as good as it was. Ultimately, when I was processing the deer, I did cut open the chest cavity to see exactly what the arrow hit going through, and lo and behold, it went through one lung and pierced right through the center of the heart. So I felt very good the fact that I was able to put such a good shot on a shot that I've never taken before, a shot that I had very little confidence of working out as well as it did. Ultimately, I'm very thankful for the fact that I would practice as much as I had with my bow equipment. Even the night before, I was, ensuring that my broadheads were ready to go and that I was, shooting accurately. Basically, I was even in the dark, just shooting, with our backyard light, trying to ensure that everything was good to go and still dialed in properly. I am thankful for the fact that I did take that additional time to make sure I was confident and competent with the bow equipment, even after putting it down during rifle season and muzzleloader season. And ultimately, realizing too that, probably the biggest reason why I was able to get as close to the deer as I did and be allowed to get within range as I did is because that deer was injured. There's probably a lot of times where that deer probably wouldn't have been on the beach to begin with, or would not have stuck around as long as it did. So it's just a testament, one of those things where you gotta, if you're stalking up on a deer or trying to approach a deer, you're always thinking about every movement that you make, about how it could, basically blow up in your face and the deer take off and you lose that opportunity. That was crossing my mind the entire process from start to finish. Knowing that more often than not, it's going to fail more than you succeed doing this aggressive, trying to approach deer like this. So the biggest thing I'm going to say with this is, taking, seeing an opportunity and, taking steps to make it happen. At any point of this time, I could have looked at this deer down at the beach and realized it was too, thinking it was too far, not worth it. But ultimately, decisions that you make during the course of that hunt, you always gotta, it's one of those things that the biggest thing I always was thinking about is, don't be afraid to fail. The likelihood of this whole thing blowing up at any second was very high, and I knew that, but I was gonna take a chance anyways. That's been, I think, my biggest thing coming out of this season is realizing that I'm definitely much more comfortable doing more active hunting than passive hunting. I would consider passive hunting, setting up in your spot, knowing that, even if you're not seeing deer at the time, knowing that you're in a good spot and that you're just going to wait it out and wait for the deer to come. Or if you're sitting like on a private piece or over a good food source or food plot or something like that, just waiting the deer out, just knowing that they're going to come to you. A lot of times I don't have the patience for that style of hunting, even though I like doing it from time to time. I'm definitely much more active hunter in the regards that I'm impatient. So it might be just impatient hunting, but I consider it active hunting, where I'm going to get down on my stand if I'm not seeing the deer, if I'm not getting the movement that I want to, if I feel like earlier in that day where I feel like I've blown out the area that I was planning on hunting, I go try to make it happen somewhere else. Again, and just like earlier in that morning where I, as I was approaching those other group of deer and those cedars, they busted me before I even had an opportunity. But it's just one of those things of always looking at that next potential opportunity and try to capitalize on that. So the entire hunt is nothing more than just that. Seeing an opportunity and trying to make the best decision that I could at the time with the information I had available. And I think that's one of the best lessons I've learned throughout the course of the entire season. And I think it's a good approach that we can take all as hunters. That was just a once in a lifetime hunt. I don't think I'll ever have another opportunity like that of, going out and harvesting a deer right on the lake shore. Quite literally had to pull the deer out of the lake. So an extremely unique situation with a lot of, lessons that I learned from that entire experience. So at this point, now I'm kind of feel like I'm rambling a little bit. So let's go ahead and wrap up for this story. Again, super blessed to have had the opportunity at going after this deer. A lot of things went right where anything at any moment could have went wrong. Basically, I'm glad that the preparation and the decisions I made did work out. One of the most unique hunts I've ever been on and probably will ever be on. So with that, basically at this point, I've more or less decided it was time to call it quits. I've got a full freezer now. I did end up trying to take my sister out for the late antler season. Basically, we kind of went at an idea of she was going to take a rifle and harvest a doe if one approached or came into the food plot as we were hunting on our private piece. I also brought my bow along in the event that a big old buck decided to show up as well. Ultimately, we didn't see anything for the night. We did see some fresh tracks as we walked out, so the deer were moving. They just decided to not come out to the food plot while we were out there sitting. So ultimately, I've decided to pack it up for the season. It's been tough a few different times, especially with some of this fresh snow that we've gotten and these cold temperatures. It's been a couple of times where I've considered, grabbing the bow and going back out and, basically trying to cut a track and try to track a deer down with my bow. But ultimately, decided that, now's a good time to call it quits. Today, we actually, my wife and I went out. We went snowshoeing. I grabbed the old 22, maybe see if we can find some squirrels or rabbits or something like that. But ultimately, we just had a nice walk out in the woods. Did a little bit of snowshoeing, got out in the wilderness a little bit, and looking forward to doing some ice fishing this year. Both my kids are, I think, eager to go out and do some more fishing again. Now that it's been, we've had to pack up the boat for the season, they're looking to, do a little bit more fishing and getting out on the hard water. This year, we're going to look into investing into an underwater camera so they can have fun with that. We can play around with that a little bit and hopefully be able to do a few fish fries with some of our catch coming up here real quick. So that's it for this episode. Coming up the season again, like I said, it's only about a week left, and we've got, basically at this point, I'm already looking at things to do for management wise for the property. Basically looking to do some clear cutting to make some bedding areas. Already looking at what I'm going to do for next year for food plot wise, and basically already looking at some additional areas scouting wise to catch up with some of these public land bucks that I missed out on or couldn't quite nail down this season to gear up right for next season. So even though the season's not quite over with, I'm already looking to the 2023 season. So, it's one of those things that, just keep building on what this year did and moving on for the next. So with that, that's a wrap. Again, as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.